Hello again, welcome back. I'm joined here for War Mysteries by Matt.
Hello.
I'm Jay. This week we are looking into something with enormous connotations for history. In late March 1945, the Allies were battling their way towards Berlin. A Kriegsmarine Type 10 U-boat was prepared in Kiel Harbour. It will not be going into battle. It's loaded with cargo crates, attended by 2 Japanese officers. It's been manned by a crew that, bar a few exceptions, will know absolutely nothing of their own mission. In just 8 weeks' time, the submarine and her crew will set in motion events that will effectively end the Second World War.
Wow.
Their mission and its subsequent impact on history would be silenced by victorious Allied powers for almost 70 years. This is the strange story of U-234. You're going to enjoy this one. I was fascinated researching this. U-boat number U-234 is that one. It's a Type 10B mine-laying U-boat that was adapted towards the end of the war to become a cargo vessel, principally for long-distance journeys, supplying cargo.
Just checking we've got the
Nazi gold
picture from last week,
continuity,
and hopefully not this as a picture for next week.
We've got another one.
Very terrible. That's much better. Much better.
There you go. U-234.
So it was a submarine.
U-boat, undersea boat, yeah. Type 10, the biggest U-boat that was ever produced by the Germans. It's massive, even bigger than the Type 9 Atlantic vessels. Huge boat.
What we're talking about today.
Yeah, we start with the U-boat itself, U-234. A crew was selected in mid-March to man a submarine for a special mission. This would have been a rather difficult task this late in the conflict. Men of experience were very limited. The fatality rate of U-boatmen and submariners was the highest of all armed forces during the war, and Germany lost a total of 660 U-boats to enemy action, of only 863 commissioned. This corresponds to a loss of 30,003 servicemen, of a total of almost 40,000. A 75% loss.
Damn. So even more losses than were felt in the air.
Yeah, in any other, percentage-wise, it was the highest attrition rate of any force in the war.
They were dying.
They were dying. Obviously, when a U-boat goes down, you ain't getting out.
You ain't getting out.
30,003 servicemen. That's a bit specific.
Very specific.
That's either meticulous records or a typo.
Captain Johann Heinrich Fehler was chosen to be the skipper of this voyage. He was one of the very best captains that remained in the Kriegsmarine. Captain Fehler was joined by other officers of note,
including Luftwaffe General Ulrich Kessler, a specialist in air defence. He's a general, so this guy is lofty. Erich Mansell, his adjutant, pencil pusher. K. Nischling, a Naval Fleet Judge Advocate. He was actually responsible for detecting spy rings.
Spy rings?
Yeah. Generally you'd have a spy master and a number of people that report to
so like the development of spying.
Yeah.
So someone
that oversees a group of spies in a country.
A spy ring.
Heinz Schlicker. He was a radar, countermeasures and infrared specialist, and he was also the inventor of an infrared proximity fuse.
It's quite niche, isn't it?
Yeah. I've tried to look into it. It's old technology now, but it was used for a while after the war, mainly in bombs. And August Bringwald, or August, I don't know how you pronounce that in German, but
say whatever you want.
He was the director of Me-262 production. So he didn't oversee the whole thing, that was Kammler. He had oversight of the actual production lines.
Okay.
Like a line manager, really.
Also among the crew were 2 Japanese officers, Lieutenant Commander Hideyoto Monaga, a submarine warfare specialist, and Lieutenant Shoji Genzo, an aeronautical engineer. They had been present in Germany for over a year and a half, on detachment from the Japanese military, to study and evaluate advanced weapons technology developed by German scientists.
A bit unusual. Japanese... They're
Officers, yeah.
On board a German submarine?
Yeah, they were in Germany for a year and a half up until that point, researching weapons, technology, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Things that could help Japan, because obviously they're...
So Japan and Germany were talking to each other. I think that's perhaps something that people don't know, generally, that Japan and Germany were in cahoots.
Well, the Japanese were the honorary Aryan brethren. There's a legend in Japanese mythology that the Japanese were descended from blue-eyed, blonde-haired people that came from the sky.
Convenient for Hitler, isn't it? The legend that is.
It's very convenient, or somebody's been honking on a crack jar.
The remaining boatmen were relatively unaware of their mission and were told only that they were bringing a shipment of material to Southeast Asia. The U-boat in question, Kiel number 234, was a Type 10 mine-laying submarine with a standard complement of 5 officers and 47 enlisted crewmen. It was the largest U-boat variant in service at the time.
It had a top speed of 7 knots submerged. That's pretty slow. But this thing is massive.
Yeah, but yeah. I mean, it's big, 7 knots, fully submerged. It's quite a pace for a submarine.
And 17 knots surfaced. Now, if you look at the V80, so it's the U-boat that was in service at the time, they only made 1, but that could do 28 knots underwater. So that's 4 times the speed.
That's very fast.
It's fast. The boat was armed with 2 flak guns, a very large caliber deck gun, and 2 torpedo tubes to the stern.
Why would they fire torpedoes from the stern?
The mine laying tubes were at the front of the boat. It had a maximum range of 18,450 nautical miles if it was surfaced, or 93 underwater. To be fair, underwater that would be on electric engines. Above water they can use diesel.
U-234 had arrived earlier in the month for repairs and refitting at Kiel Harbour, and it was modified to carry cargo containers in the internal magazines originally designed to hold mines. U-234 was one of only 2 remaining Type 10 boats, of 8 total. The other 6 had all been lost in combat.
Most of them were lost in the Atlantic. 1 was lost off the coast of Costa Rica, I think. 1 down near Africa somewhere. So yeah, they didn't fare too well, but they were mine layers. So they generally did their job and came back. So next on the list of things we're going to look at is the cargo that was on board.
The boat was loaded by dock crew, and a manifest completed. This manifest in particular would become a key point of controversy surrounding the fate of the boat. Listed on the manifest were some 240 tons of cargo, including the following items.
A large quantity of military blueprints, par for the course if they're sharing technology.
It's fine.
2 crated Messerschmitt 262s, dismantled and put in boxes.
Kit planes.
Pretty much. 1 crated Henschel 293 glide bomb. That's a big
bomb. Yeah.
V2 rocket components, instructions, a consignment of jet engines. They will be Jumo 004s, BMW 003s.
Sort of stuff that powered the 262s?
Yeah, and the Hortons. Those are Jumo 004s on there.
If you can see them.
Paperwork and research papers from a variety of technology projects.
General paper.
Just general
paperwork. It's fine.
Assorted armament, weapons, offensive equipment. Diesel fuel, obviously. Not going anywhere without that. Optical grade glass, generally for telescopes.
Okay.
Mercury.
The planet? On board a submarine? I don't think so.
He's been drinking. Drawings of electric torpedoes. They were a new development.
Why not? Scribble them out when you got the good ideas.
Are you alright? Don't draw my phone.
I'm not drawing on
That's my War Mysteries folder.
The War Mysteries
This is
folder
infamous.
Is fine. Yeah, that should be underlined.
This is infamous. You just put a line through that. Medical supplies and instruments.
It's a good thing to have on board.
Need that stuff. Food and supplies for a long journey. Without that,
Obviously.
it's not happening. 80 metallic tubes divided into crates of 10. About that tall. So 60, 70 centimetres tall, about that wide. Just think of 80 massive thermos flasks.
That's really random.
Well, they come into play later. 50 leaded cubes. Depending on who you believe, they were said to be on board.
Could be 49.
That's 50. Infrared proximity fuses, which I mentioned.
Fair enough.
Several wooden cases and barrels filled with water. I'm assuming heavy water, which is what they were developing in Norway.
Members of the dock crew noted that the Japanese officers were observing the loading of the cargo, and that they labelled each of the crates containing the metallic tubes U-235. One of the dock workers later commented, "We watched as the Japanese men labelled the crates with U-235, and we quietly joked among ourselves that they don't know what our Kiel number is. We were sailing a U-234. It wasn't until later that we collectively realised the implications of this. The Japanese, of course, knew exactly what they were doing."
That comes into play big time later on. So, that's the cargo. A lot of shit. So, next up, the voyage.
On the evening of March 25th, U-234 departed from Kiel Harbour, bound for Kristiansand in Norway. It was accompanied by 3 coastal U-boats and surface escort vessels, and arrived at the Horten naval base around March 28th. After snorkel trials and refuelling, the boat finally set sail on April 15th, 1945. At this point, the crewmen were given a little more information regarding their mission, including their ultimate destination, the Empire of Japan. The boat progressed towards the North Sea, and then out into the Northern Atlantic at snorkel depth for 16 days, surfacing afterwards into a severe storm, which Captain Failer was convinced would keep them safe.
The journey was relatively unremarkable until the crew noticed that the Goliath, a very low frequency transmitter, had ceased to send any transmissions.
That's bad.
Pretty bad, because that is what coordinates all of the U-boats in the Atlantic. It's a huge transmitter, and it had gone quiet permanently, as it would turn out. Followed shortly by radio silence from the Nauen station in Brandenburg. Now that's the backup gone. So now they are completely on their own, and they only have shortwave radio to communicate with nearby boats. Failer did not know at this point that the 2 transmission stations had been captured and deactivated by Allied forces. Now bear in mind that they set sail on April 15th. 16 days later would be May 1st. Hitler's dead. War's over, basically.
On May 4th, U-234 received a broken transmission from American and British radio stations that Hitler was dead and Karl Dönitz had become Germany's head of state. On May 10th, approximately halfway across the Atlantic, the boat surfaced for better signal reception. They then received the official order to surrender from Dönitz. Failer initially suspected a trick, but upon contacting U-873 in the nearby vicinity and communicating with her captain, he was convinced the message was genuine. He decided to discuss these developments with his crew, and finally decided to surrender to the US Navy, knowing they would be very unlikely to reach Japan without support.
To surrender because the war was over.
Yeah, they said cease and desist, surface your boats and raise a black flag on your mast and surrender your boats to the nearest Allied port. They were told to go to Nova Scotia.
I can see my breath.
Yes, let's get on with it. Okay, so
I need a piss.
This was very bad news for officers Tomonaga and Genso, who were still at war with America, and to be captured was considered to be a great dishonour. Both officers wrote letters to their families and committed suicide in their quarters by taking a massive dose of luminol, a barbiturate sedative. They were buried at sea with full military honours by order of Captain Failer.
Bad news for the Japs.
Very bad news.
And they're on the submarine.
There's nothing they can do about it. By May 19th, U-234 was in dock at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, having surrendered to the USS Sutton. All crew members were now prisoners of war.
USS Sutton, was that a
destroyer?
Frigate, a destroyer?
So, it didn't end too well for them. But U-234 is now in dock. They actually were told to go to Nova Scotia because that was their nearest port, but they didn't want to surrender to the Canadians because they thought that they would be less lenient. They thought that the Americans would just send them home.
Fair enough.
The next thing that we're going to look at is what happened immediately after the boat docked, which is where the story really starts to get quite interesting. Upon arrival to the port, the boat was placed under lockdown.
Upon the discovery of crates labelled U-235 that were loaded into the magazines and cargo holds of the submarine, the dockyards at Portsmouth were immediately locked down. All reporters were ejected from the area, and servicemen were ordered to shoot on sight anyone attempting to speak to the prisoners.
Quite a few submarines had surrendered at this point, obviously because they'd received the broadcast. Not all of them did, some had to be hunted down. So you can imagine that it was generally accepted news by this point that boats would be coming into dock all over the world.
War was over.
Yeah, the war's over, so why was this one such a big deal?
The cylinders were removed from their crates and were found to be lined with gold, a non-reactive metal. Within them were approximately 560 kilograms of powdered, weapons-grade uranium-235.
That's enriched weapons-grade uranium, and there is only really one application for that: atomic bombs.
At the time of the U-boat surrender, the Manhattan Project, widely known as the US Atomic Bomb Project, was well underway in America. But what is less renowned is the struggle to develop enriched fissile material for a bomb. This process was extraordinarily expensive and very time-consuming. By February 7th, 1945, the US had around 10 kilograms of enriched uranium-235, and it was estimated by project staff that they would have another 5 kilograms by May 1st.
And they've just found a U-boat with 560 kilograms on it of this stuff. The amount of uranium required for an atomic bomb was closer to 50 to 60 kilograms per bomb, far in excess of what the Americans had available to them.
By August of the same year, the 22 kiloton Trinity device had been successfully tested in the Jornada del Muerto desert, and both 15 kiloton Little Boy and 21 kiloton Fat Man atomic bombs were deployed to devastating effect over Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. The Japanese announced their surrender 6 days later.
Of course.
So how did they go from having 15 kilograms of U-235 to more than enough for 3 bombs and more in the space of 2 or 3 months? It's got to be this U-boat.
Given that it would have taken at least until the end of 1946 to enrich enough uranium to weapons-grade material for even one of these devices, this information from the Manhattan Project staff themselves, and despite 2 huge shipments of uranium oxide from Germany and the Congo earlier in the war,
there can be no doubt where this enriched material originated.
From the submarine.
And therefore, Nazi Germany. Which raises a pretty terrifying prospect. How close were they to having an atomic weapon? Now, history tells us that the Americans persistently thought that the Germans were far behind in their atomic efforts. But the facts just don't support that.
It seems that the majority of the active ingredients that were acquired from that U-boat. Okay.
Well, the thing is, remember that it had these proximity fuses, which the Americans didn't have and hadn't perfected the technology for, and yet, all of a sudden, their bombs work. They hadn't been able to produce anywhere near the amount of uranium that they needed for a bomb.
It takes a long time to enrich that, doesn't it? And
a very long time.
And to bring it to a point where it can be used.
Or 500 kilograms of raw uranium, uranium oxide or whatever other substrate it comes in, that can be refined into 500 grams of U-235. And there were 560 kilos of it on board this U-boat. It's a factor of 100.
Germans have been busy.
Very busy. So, the conclusion is that the world's first atomic device may indeed have been German.
The implications of the U-234 cargo are terrifying and far-reaching. Not only were the Germans able to produce uranium-235 in significantly greater amounts than any other nation, but they had managed to do so in utter secrecy. Were Nazi Germany able to extend the war for a few months longer, it's very likely they would have deployed their atomic weapons in the European theatre, or that the Japanese military would have developed their own, using the materials sent by U-234.
Definitely, definitely, if they had that ability.
Well, it's a standoff weapon, isn't it? You drop these bombs on your border, it's going to irradiate the area, it's going to wipe out anything there. One other interesting thing to note is I've read quite a lot. There's a ton more of this that we haven't really got time to go into. But there were at least 2 reports of massive explosions in Germany in 1943 and 1944. The same region, which was in Thuringia. It has the highest background gamma radiation readings in all of Germany, even today.
So maybe they were testing these weapons. Maybe they were hidden tests.
Well, there is more. This was recovered at some point at the end of the war. And what does it look like to you before we show them?
It looks like somebody is trying to work out how close their house is to something like local blockbusters or...
Right, I'm going to show them now. So this is something that was recovered towards the end of the war. It shows 3 concentric circles on lower Manhattan. But it shows a blast radius of 4 kilometres and a lethal blast radius of just over 2.
So this is a map of the damage potential of some sort of atomic device.
It could be atomic, that's the implication, but there is no other weapon in existence at the point in history this was made that could do anywhere near that kind of blast damage. Number 2, you may have heard of the Junkers 390. One of those. Developed from the Ju-290. This was a 6-engine massive transport aircraft.
It's humongous.
And on August 27th, 1943, one of those aircraft flew from Bordeaux in France to 12 miles off the coast of New York and back without refuelling. Why would you do that? To prove it can be done? Maybe. But this is the only aircraft that would have been capable of carrying an atomic weapon. The implication again being that it can only be a test flight.
So the suggestion is that then the Germans were developing some sort of atomic device to drop on New York.
At the time, it's the financial centre of America. There's a large port there, which is where all the Americans sailed over to Europe from. The effects would be devastating. If they were able to conduct a strike, they would show America that they are not immune from the German war machine. The implication would be that the Americans would be so demoralised by this attack and possibly subsequent attacks, because they could also reach Pennsylvania and New Hampshire in that kind of radius of flight, and therefore they would capitulate or leave the war in some way. Scary thing to think. So if you think about it, it's pretty lucky they found this submarine. It's pretty lucky that the war ended when it did, because it was over halfway across the Atlantic. There was also tentative evidence that the Japanese were also working on their own atomic bomb, and they would have needed this material. They had the expertise, they just didn't have the technology available to them.
Technology-less.
Yeah.
By all accounts after the war, Germany was widely regarded by the rest of the world to have made primitive but largely unsuccessful attempts to develop an atomic weapon. Recently declassified documentation has shown this not necessarily to be the case. This evidence would naturally lead to the conclusion that Nazi Germany, and not America, had developed the world's first atomic weapon, and may have even been in a position to use them. In perhaps one of the greatest ironies in history, the shipment of uranium-235 that was intended to help Japan was ultimately used to cripple them. As one Air Force pilot of the time remarked, "The German uranium was delivered to Japan after all. It was just delivered by the Americans."
There you go.
Harsh.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of extra background reading that people can do on this, if they're even bothered. The implication is enormous. Had the Germans deployed an atomic weapon during the war, the outcome could have been, it could have been game-changing. hugely significant. One might say explosive. But there you go. You know, history is written by the victor. Had it taken him just a couple of months longer to get through to Berlin or forced to surrender, history could have been very different. So that's it. Crazy really to think that they had this potential. And it was so well hidden. It was obviously something that's only recently come to light. Because I didn't know anything about this until I looked into it. So shit happens in the sea.